All right, we're going to begin, everyone. I apologize for the delay here. We're going to move on from our extended look at the Enlightenment and the Romantic era, two sides of the same coin. I think I have been arguing the Romantic period being a reaction to the perceived excesses of the Enlightenment and its view of rationalism, which is a certain type of engagement with nature. I portrayed that to you in just looking at the gardens of the Palace of Versailles, if you recall, as an example, really, or an illustration of the way in which the dominion mandate given to Adam and Eve was reconceptualized in this period, and in which nature was approached by means of a reason that now became very mathematical, geometrical, and rational through and through. So it's a way of approaching nature that we could see there. And that's a postulate of the notion of human nature that is bequeathed to us by René Descartes. I think I've talked about this already, but let me say a little bit more about it, because today's novella, Dr. Jekyll and Mr Hyde, is rooted in a different anthropology than that of Christianity. And at the same time, it is dealing with topics which are going to be of intense interest to Christians, and something we need to reflect on as well, whether we're Christian or not. And so let me recapitulate something about what Descartes said, just to bring it fresh to your minds. I know you've just had a midterm, some of you. Descartes, in around 1640, writes a work, Meditations on First Philosophy, which is responding, to my mind, to a challenge to the old astronomy. Astronomy, the view of astronomy that he got from, or at least his culture got from Ptolemy, an Egyptian astronomer. And that view of astronomy had it that the planets revolved around Earth. Earth was at the center of the cosmos, and the other planets revolved around it in concentric spheres. And Galileo, and there are other theories out there, one of them being the one that was eventually accepted, that of Nicholas Copernicus. Copernicus said, no, the planets are all revolving around the sun. They're not revolving around the Earth, they're revolving around the sun. That was not the dominant theory at the time. The dominant theory is that the Earth is still and everything revolves around us. And we still have held on to this in our language, because we speak of the sun rising and the sun setting. We see the sun moving, the moon moves around us, we're standing still. Right? We're not moving. Do you feel like you're moving when you're sitting here in this room? No, you feel like you're entirely still. And the Earth everything's moving around us, right? So in a sense, the old view is not irrational. It's, on the contrary, entirely rational. It fits the appearances of things that we can see all around us. But Galileo proves with his new technological instrument, this thing called a telescope, that it cannot be true that the Earth is standing still and that everything revolves around the Earth. Furthermore, it can't be true. And he does this by showing, you can see with his telescope, that Jupiter has moons, 4 of them, that don't revolve around the Earth. They in fact revolve around Jupiter. And therefore, the whole theory is now got some questions. They also observe a Danish astronomer by the name of Tycho Brahe, if I pronounce that right. He sees a supernova, which also goes across the sky, and he observes it and says, again, this does not fit the old cosmology at all. It can't be. So the evidence starts to pile up that makes our eyes, as a means of verifying truth, questionable, to put it mildly. Skeptical ideas then start to fly into the West, revival of views or theories that make us question our senses as their ability to deliver knowledge to us. And Descartes comes to a very radical conclusion, though, because he observes that he can't trust his eyes. He can't trust what he previously thought was absolutely certain, and refers explicitly to the heavens and so forth. And so he adopts a method to achieve certainty, because at the moment he says he's cast in total doubt. And what's the method? Well, it's the famous Cartesian method of doubt. And it is a sort of, well, how do I get rid of doubt? Well, I will doubt everything I possibly can until I get to a fixed point of certainty. In the old astronomy, the fixed point of certainty was the Earth, but that was connected to astronomy that he can no longer believe. So what is the fixed point of certainty? Well, he doubts, so he begins a method of doubt that doubts absolutely everything, until he gets to the point where he can no longer doubt anything. And what's that point? That he can no longer doubt anything. He doesn't doubt that he's doubting. He's certain of the fact that he's doubting. And if he's doubting, he's thinking. And if he's thinking, then he exists. And if he exists, he can conceive of a being infinitely superior to him, namely God, and therefore God also exists. So he comes to establish certitude through the method of doubt. Descartes, when he's thinking about himself, is going to apply this personally to himself as well. He also doubts, so he knows that he's thinking. And that thinking thing, what he calls in Latin a res cogitans, res just means a thing, and it's thinking, has an extension, his body. But his body is also called just an extension of this thing. He calls it res extensa. And his anthropology that comes out of this has been called a ghost in a machine, because he establishes that the reality of his, what we will call reason, is clear and certain, but the reality of his body is not so certain. It's predicated on his rational faculties, and it's not really given an entity unto itself. It's totally dependent on his rationalizing. And from that come views of human nature and the natural order to some degree, which suggests that nature has no nature. When I say nature now, I'm talking about the external world, outside of the mind. And that it's sort of like a machine. I said Descartes' view of his own nature has been described by later writers as a ghost in a machine. The mind is the ghost, the body is the machine, and so is the whole of nature hereafter. It's seen in terms of a grand machine. Nature itself is seen as a machine, a very mechanistic view of nature. And the Romantics, as we've seen, object to this idea. Even Swift presents the problem with this view of human nature. If you see us just as stuff, without any spirit, without any soul, then we can manipulate it through statistics. And we can call it scientific, but actually it's just dehumanizing. So we've already seen the early critique of this in Jonathan Swift, and we've seen the Romantics respond to this idea of desecrating nature. They try and solve that problem by reestablishing a sanctity in nature. Wordsworth talks about the sense of God he perceives in everything. I call that panentheism. Right? And last time we looked at Coleridge and talked about how he flipped it around. And rather than Wordsworth's supernatural naturalism, it's natural supernaturalism. He presents natural objects and or supernatural beings in very natural forms. And he gave it a Christian sort of structure. But is he really engaging with it as a Christian? That's a question, actually. Just because he uses Christian language, Christian motifs, doesn't mean this is a real Christian engagement per se. It just has the appearance of it. At any rate, this problem is a legacy of Descartes I'm submitting to you. And when Robert Louis Stevenson writes Dr. Jekyll and Mr Hyde, he's engaging with the same problem. of human nature. And he's not the first to do that. Now, what he is writing here is a form of writing that we could call the Gothic novel. Gothic novels became very popular in the late 18th century, early 19th century. The most famous of them may be Mary Shelley's Frankenstein. I used to teach that here on this course. I do teach it in my science fiction and subcreation course still, but I didn't want to do the same novel over and over in multiple courses. If you want to take that course, then you'll get me engaging with that. But she is dramatizing, that is Shelley, a scenario whereby we can even take human bodies, the scientist, that is, disinter them, that is, dig them up from their graves, patch them back together, use what Shelley calls galvanism, the theory of galvanism, put electricity through them, in other words, and then bring them to life. And the way Shelley portrays it, there's something monstrous about this whole enterprise. We call the Frankenstein creature, the 8-foot-tall being, the monster. But actually, it's Victor, the scientist, who is portrayed as monstrous. It's what he does that gives birth to this monstrosity, which is actually the product of his scientific endeavor, that has no relation or sees no sanctity to life, and sees it as a distant thing, as a material substance that he can do whatever he wants with and act as a creator, act as a god. So it's a critique within literature of the developments that are taking place in science. And we've already seen it. We've seen it with, as I say, Swift. We've seen the Romantics' response to the Enlightenment and the view of human nature that they present to us. And now we're going to see it in Robert Louis Stevenson. This is, as I say, it is a Gothic novella written in 1886, by the way. So this is late Victorian period. Unlike Mary Shelley's Frankenstein, which was written in 1818. So significant period has passed. But they're dealing with very similar sorts of things. The only reason I put this one on, in addition to what I said about not wanting to repeat the same things in multiple classes, is this one's shorter. And I didn't want you to have to read a 200-page novella when you can read one that is 50 pages at this stage in the semester. Dealing with the same sort of thing. But this is famous. I mean, it is so famous that, in fact, both of them are famous. Frankenstein, everyone knows who Frankenstein is. Everyone knows what we mean by Jekyll and Hyde. It's a phrase that's passed into the English language to describe a certain polarity of or opposition. You know, if you say somebody's a real Jekyll and Hyde figure, you mean that sometimes they seem really nice, and the next day they're just this monster. What on earth? Inexplicable. I think what Stevenson is exploring is the same thing William Blake was exploring. Innocence and experience. Two contrary states of the human soul. But in both cases, in Blake and in Stevenson and throughout the period, they're having to deal with the problem of Descartes' anthropology, the idea that we are minds in bodies, but the bodies are not really who we are. They're more or less machines. And they're machines that we can do whatever we want with them, with impunity, or rather we give the scientist who represents the brains or the minds best, because they follow the procedures of mathematics rigorously. The modern sciences follow the procedures of mathematics, right? And they simply apply it to human nature in the modern sciences, or in the social sciences, or in the human sciences, if you will. And in this precise period, 1886, that is what's happened. So there's the difference between what I described in the 18th century as an approach to nature. We see it as something that we can gain power over, the stuff outside of us. Wordsworth already doesn't like that. Says that we're desecrating something that is good and holy. But now it's been applied to human beings themselves. And the social sciences, psychology, sociology, anthropology, and even modern medicine is now doing things with human bodies that were not done in the past. Among other things, they're cutting into human bodies. which was considered in the past an absolute no-no. You don't cut into human bodies. There's a sort of a Rubicon you're crossing here. You also don't inject things into you, which we now do with impunity, and take pills and so forth. There were natural herbal remedies that were used in the past, of course, so it's not that you're not taking anything in, but are you taking a scientific concoction to address a problem with your mind? So the mind-body problem of philosophy is also here in view in this novel. And what I think, and this is one of the things I found compelling about literature, this is why I studied it, is I think, and you may disagree, that literature engages with cultural issues more profoundly and more palpably, more effectively than do the speculations of theologians and philosophers, although they're dealing with the same issues. For which reason we, to this day, appeal to the novelist or the poet when we're really trying to understand something and explain it to other people. It includes all sorts of details, which a philosopher is going to put to one side and let me get down to the hard facts of the matter. And I think that's what Stevenson does here. Now, I said it was a Gothic novella, a short novel. Another way of calling it would be a shilling shocker. So it's a shilling's a British, the British currency of the day, and that's all it costs. It was very cheap. In the United States, it was republished, and it was called A Penny Dreadful. Same thing. It's short, it's cheap, and it's for mass production, and it was consumed by the masses. Very popular. So popular that then, as I say, it became a part of the popular imagination, grabbed people's attention. And the Gothic genre becomes a part of fiction thereafter, particularly in the work of, say, Edgar Allan Poe, if you are a fan of his work, if you read any of that, or Stephen Crane, The Headless Horseman, and so forth, made into Disney movies. And with this, the idea of a sort of engagement with the dark side of human nature. Here's the problem. How does Descartes' rationalist engagement with human nature deal with the problem that Christians call sin? Christians have a very clear explanation for why bad things happen, why people who seem respectable and good do atrocious things, apparently in flagrant contradiction to their apparent character. It's absolutely clear because we've inherited the original sin of Adam, and we have a sinful human nature. That's why. And we're all, as a consequence, sinners, and therefore when we do things that are against our normal pattern of character, it's because we've inherited Adam's sin and we are sinners. That's why. Descartes will not accept that, because Descartes begins from the point of his reasoning capacity, and sin is not really a rational category. Either you can reason about something and understand it, or you can't understand it. And you will just say, well, sin, that's something that I can't explain. But there's no, from the beginning point of thinking, sin becomes a category which is thrown out the window. It's an unacceptable imposition on the way in which the Cartesian mind looks at the world, and modern science follows Descartes in framing these things. But then it has the problem, which we've already seen Swift had to deal with, and the Romantics had to deal with, which is how then do we account for the fact that the world around us appears not only natural but also fallen. And they come up with accounts of the fall. And the account of the fall of the Romantics is that we are good in our nature. And then society corrupts us. It makes us bad, but we're inherently good. And with that view, politicians, social sciences will try and correct the socialization problems. So we just need to fix society to let our nature come out of itself and express itself in its fundamental goodness. And the degree to which they will do that varies. But that will go all the way from socialization, so behavioral type things, to what we find here in this novella, which is that we will involve medical intervention. We'll inject ourselves with things. In our day, with COVID, it's mRNA. It's gene therapy. We'll treat a virus at the level of genetic therapy. We're going to try and change the human body so that that jab that we're given will fight off the virus. We're not going to let the body itself do that. We'll intervene to do that. But you can do that through chemical means as well for mood disorders of various sorts. You can take a chemical means. A lot of people take those. When they do this, they're actually engaging in the problem of human nature that Descartes bequeathed to us. And it's right at the heart of the problem of psychology. In the early days of psychology, Sigmund Freud's the father of modern psychology, Freud will think that the ego is a sort of a self, a willful self, and there is a sort of reasoning, which he calls a superego, which we get from society. But then it's opposed by a dark, unconscious or subconscious thing that he calls the id. I think I'm right in this. It's been a while since I looked at Freud. But what we find here in Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde is something like the id, the irrational and to some degree dark, malevolent side of human nature, bursting through the socialized, rational attempts to keep it down, and the will, the ego, embracing that at times. And the way we try to solve that problem is through chemicals, and that's exactly what Dr. Jekyll does. So he doesn't do it the way Frankenstein does it on somebody else's body. He does it even on his own body. He's going to take the shot himself to deal with the problem that a Christian would call sin. But a man of science is not going to associate with that because, again, there is no category from a rational perspective for sin. He's going to explain it as a physical defect. He's got something wrong with his metabolism. Today we'd say it's genetics. It's a genetic inheritance or something. And there's something defective in our genes. We'll correct that through therapy. Or something biochemical that's gone wrong. Well, here's a pill to moderate that and to level things out. That view of the body is seeing the body as a machine that needs to be fixed with chemical means. It's not a problem of rebellion against God. It's not a problem of a moral sort. The Enlightenment actually rejects the idea of morality as having any factual basis whatsoever. So the famous Scottish Enlightenment philosopher David Hume says that what we call morality is our values that we place on things. We think this is good, this is evil. We evaluate, that's our values, but there's no factual basis for this whatsoever. There's no factual basis for that. We can't prove good and evil. It's a value that we have. It may be important, but it's not something that we can scientifically verify, and it ought not to be understood in the same way. So we create a sort of a two-tier system here of facts on the one hand that science will verify and operate in accordance with, and values that we will dismiss or reduce to subjective responses. And the task of education is to base our social structure on objective, scientific basis and to dismiss the values. If you're interested, again, another book I look at, not in this course, but regularly here at Tyndale, is C.S. Lewis's The Abolition of Man. And he addresses this explicitly as the aim of modern education, to try and debunk value judgments as having any importance to education at all. And Lewis's objection is, but actually training people in wisdom and virtue is the essence of education. Jesus tells us to follow him. We're supposed to be like him. The pagans say the same thing. We're supposed to be like Telemachus. We're supposed to follow a mentor. We're supposed to be like him. There's a moral example. We're supposed to do what he does. We're not just supposed to know what he knows. We're supposed to do what he does. We're supposed to be like him. So there's an ineradicably moral side of becoming an adult. It's what it means to be a human being. We look to the example of adults. Remember what I said, what happens in the Romantic period? Who becomes the hero? The orphan. The child becomes the role model. All of these are reflections and twisting around of the Cartesian view of human nature. And so we're going to start from ground zero, doubting everything. We'll get down to the thing that is the most common denominator of all things, the child. Or even more importantly, and more shorn of human connections, the orphan. The orphan has no parents. He'll have to determine his own nature. The scientist here in Dr. Jekyll is exactly doing that. He's experimenting on himself. And Stevenson is presenting the horror scenarios that can ensue from that. I should say one final thing. Between the Romantics and Stevenson lies the publication of Darwin's Origin of Species. It's not essential to the novella, but I do think it has some influence because Mr. Hyde is described as a more primitive and less developed version of Dr. Jekyll. And the popular take on Darwin, which is hard not to conclude, is that Darwin believes that apes are our immediate ancestors. We've evolved from the apes. And so what we see here in Mr. Hyde is a devolution of the civilized Dr. Jekyll into a uncivilized, barbaric, primitive Mr. Hyde. He's described in those terms. And here you can see it on the screen. We've got the man hunched over. He's not standing upright. He acts in accordance not only with animal desires, but dark, malevolent, sinful ones. Stevenson's suggesting there's more than simply the animal and the reasoning thing here. There is something of what we would call sin in the discussion. Comments or questions? I've said a lot here to introduce the novel. I wanted to frame it in terms of the whole course. Throughout my aim on this, it's first year English, is to try and show how culture changes and to be able to stand back from it and to show the contours of the change and where the key turning points lie, and then to try and assess it, not just to accept it or to be entertained by it, although the great works of literature, I do think, delight us, but they also teach us. They teach us something, but we don't have to accept what they teach. We should scrutinize what they teach. Note that the way, and there were no questions, so I'll just stop at this.